Well, one lesson I can say is we keep saying never again. And each time we say never again, the level of guilt rises. And so we, I suppose, exert more efforts towards ensuring that never again does become a reality. And so the lessons learned is that we have to be better organized, better equipped, better informed, and be proactive in preventing possible genocides well before the situation escalates to the point of denial. And by denial, I don't mean only the perpetrators of genocide. Those who would be called upon to step in and stop it are usually reticent to recognize it for what it is. That's why prevention at an early stage is a much better option. Well, the responsibility to protect is based on three pillars, which I have to say on a personal note are the pillars that guided me when I first introduced the idea of sovereignty as responsibility to guide me in the work I did for 12 years as Special Representative of the Secretary General on internally displaced people, which by definition is internal and therefore falls under the sovereignty of the state, and the state is obviously very sensitive about protecting its sovereignty. What I tried to do, building on work I had done on Africa program at Brookings, to see how the end of the Cold War affects the way we perceive conflicts. We used to see conflicts as proxy wars and depended on the superpowers, either for resolving them or managing them or aggravating them. And with the withdrawal of the superpowers, we had to rethink how to approach these conflicts, see them in their proper context as regional and also as internal. And it also meant that responsibility had to be apportioned or reapportioned. Instead of depending on the superpowers, the states had to assume their responsibility for managing their situations. And if they need help, to call on the international community to help. And only in the extreme cases where there's large suffering, massive amount of suffering and death, and the countries are unable to stop it, the world cannot sit and not get involved in one way or another. Well, that principle, which was summarized in a book we called Sovereignty as Responsibility, guided me in my work on internal displacement. And the idea was to tell governments, I realize this is an internal matter, it falls under your sovereignty, I'm respectful of your sovereignty, but I don't see sovereignty as a negative concept. I see it as a positive concept of state responsibility for its people, if need be with the help of the international community. That is a concept that evolved through the Canadian-sponsored Commission on State Sovereignty and Intervention, onto the High Panel of the Secretary General on Threats and Common Challenges, on to the Summit 2005. And the responsibility to protect rests on these three pillars: the responsibility of the state, support for the state, and in extreme cases, a more robust international involvement. It has come to be seen as largely a tool for intervention, which is why it is becoming controversial. If seen in its proper context, even if some people may claim that there's nothing totally new, and of course there's never anything totally new, including the notion of sovereignty as responsibility, it's a means of focusing our attention, pulling together, mobilizing people, stimulating them to all act with a common purpose of stopping these atrocities and genocide. Well, Boutros Ghali used to tell me when I was working with him on internal displacement, that the fear of third world countries about intervention by powerful countries of the North is misplaced, because quite often the problem is the reverse. It is the lack of interest or reticence to get involved in situations where you may put your young people in harm's way. And therefore, the fear, although grounded in historical experience, going back to imperialism, colonialism and other instances of intervention, the fear is largely an exaggeration of what in fact might be the reverse, and that is the lack of interest on the part of these countries to get involved. What is happening, though, is the last pillar of R2P is being taken as the one defining R2P. And what happened in this last debate was that almost not all, but most countries spoke favorably of R2P, but expressed concerns. What happened in the end is the president, of course, opened the panel before the debate with his view of the situation, which was largely cautious and perhaps even negative, and ended the debate by highlighting the concerns and relegating the support to a secondary position. So we will have to wait and see, number one, whether the dust will settle and people will begin to see R2P in its proper perspective. And in the long run, even if it is not a totally new idea, it is a means of raising momentum and of, as you said, I think, galvanizing international action to stop what we feel must be stopped. Well, in a way, it's a combination of a model that people can look to and perhaps emulate. It's a model where a former Secretary General who has tremendous influence still in the world, despite being former, where the current Secretary of State, highly motivated also to follow in the footsteps of his predecessor in preventing these crimes, where the United Nations, the AU, virtually the whole international community rallied behind the efforts by African leaders, headed perhaps by Kofi Annan, but by others. And this pulling together and intensely looking for options to that violence worked. The question, though, is how often will the international community act with the same resolve and in concert to bring about change? And we see situations where, as I'm sure you have in mind, situations where the same action has not been mobilized. Well, you see, I think what happened in the case of Kenya is, as I just said now, people acted as soon as the crisis manifested itself, they acted with a resolve to stop it. Now, if people wait until such point when everybody is becoming more or less defensive and in denial, where they claim these things are not happening, where they see international involvement as interference with their sovereignty, where to some extent there is no mutual, there's no common ground and mutual desire to find solutions, it cannot work. One of the reasons why prevention is important at an early stage is to appear to be working together with governments to help them do what it is in their own responsibility to do. And so it's a question really of getting the resolve of the international community and the political will. This doesn't happen by simply reporting the facts of what is happening. It happens with mobilization, with stimulation, with motivating people to work with a common purpose. No government would like to see genocide or mass atrocities, different kinds of crimes happening in their country. So the question is, do we tap them early enough to engage constructively in ending whatever is evolving and escalating into genocidal levels? Well, you know, my position as special advisor on the prevention of genocide, I often say this is an impossible mandate that must be made possible. And the only way to make it possible is for the mandate to be seen as a catalyst for a much greater level of involvement by all concerned within the UN, outside the UN, involving governments, regional organizations, civil society, individuals as well as institutions. And people have different roles. For instance, even with my IDP work, when I engage governments constructively to do what is really their responsibility to do, one was able to gain entry into countries, access to the people who are displaced in a manner that was seen as constructive by governments, perhaps seen by some as a soft approach. But once you go to the country and you see situations, you have to report quite candidly. And so if NGOs, humanitarian agencies and others are monitoring the situation and reporting, it is my responsibility to bring to the attention of the government, perhaps in a persuasive manner, This is what is being said about what's happening in your country. Even if they deny, denial itself means that we should not do it, we are not doing it, and perhaps if we appear to be doing it, quietly we'll go back and do something about it so that we can show the world that these allegations are not founded. That is constructive. Civil society, and I used to tell governments this, are now in the post-Cold War era playing a vital role. In fact, they are much more trusted by the international community sometimes than the governments. And therefore, it is in the interest of governments to work with them, not as adversaries, but as potential allies in addressing the problems in their own countries. Well, first of all, what is the core of genocidal conflicts? I think there are conflicts of identities or identity-related conflicts. Genocide Convention talks about national groups, racial groups, religious groups, and ethnic groups. It is not the mere differences based on these groups that generates conflict. It's the discrimination, the marginalization, exclusion, denial of fundamental rights, denial of the rights of citizenship, inequitable distribution of power, of wealth, of services, of employment opportunities. So if that is the key, then what you want to work for is equity, is justice. It's generating a distribution pattern that does not discriminate on the basis of these grounds. Yes, development becomes a major factor because usually it is the marginalized, the deprived, that sooner or later find a way of reacting against the injustice, perhaps even by rebellion. And that rebellion then generates an onslaught from the more powerful governments against the so-called rebels, and you have a chain that can become genocidal. Well, I can't comment on specific situations because you have to know a lot more about what's going on to be able to tell. As a general rule, early intervention, by intervention I don't mean unwelcome intervention or military intervention. I mean early involvement on a multilateral basis where all the capacities of the international system, working in concert with the United Nations and others, to address situations before they escalate to a level of violence that becomes very difficult to deal with. When things become violent and you are forced to use military force to address the situation, it inevitably becomes very messy. And that's why even when I paid my last mission to Darfur in 2004, and there was a lot of talk about potential intervention, I knew even then that military action could only complicate matters. But the option is not to say military action or non-action. The option is to see how people can get involved early, exhaust peaceful means, as I said, make the government realize that it is their responsibility to their people, that their legitimacy, their place in the international community, respectability, decency, requires that they live up to certain responsibilities. But if they need help, to call on the international community to give help that will then be seen as a positive partnership, not intervention. But when in the extreme situations people are suffering and dying, it's also not an option to say involving ourselves militarily is too dangerous. There has to be a way of getting involved in a constructive way. First peacefully, exhaust all the peaceful means, but if need be, ultimately, a much more organized, effective, collective military action.